Hello everyone, this is Roger Capello. After quite a hiatus, I'm bringing you my week at the club, my weekly exploits at the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. I'm sorry about the time that I've missed. I've had a number of interesting games, and I've thought from time to time that I should at least give quick summaries of those games, but we'll see whether or not that happens. But this week we started on the annual club championship, which is this year is an 8 round robin, and people qualified that for that invitations to the 8 round robin by being the top scorers in the club over the course of the year. So these are the top 8 scorers that made it into the round robin, which is a little different system than what we used last year, and gives a little more reward to consistent attendees to the club. People show up and make sure they try to win their points every week. So this week was the first round. I played Mike Commisso, who I played not too long ago, and I've made a few videos of him in the past. And I was playing black in this particular game, and decided, because of the results of some of our earlier games, to go with a different setup as black than I had before. So not to play a double king pawn opening, but instead I went with a French defense. And Mike right away, thought about his second move and then played what was a surprise for me with knight c3. This is playable. I mean, it's played about 1% of the time against the French, according to my database. But it's not something that I'm very familiar with. And the move seems to have some drawbacks. It locks in the pawn that's on c2, which sometimes, in some variations of the French, wants to support white's pawn center. And it also doesn't, even though it attacks d5, that's a square that really white doesn't have a holdover. So that isn't too important. I think the main threat produced by this move is that the knight at some point might go to, might not want to go there. Let's try that again. Might play up to b5 and then into d6 with check, and that might be awkward for black. But so I have to be a little careful about that. What I proceeded with was just d5 to stay in the main lines of the French. Instead, of course, I could have at this point transposed into a Sicilian with c5, but I didn't really want to play that. So instead, I played d5, and Mike surprised me again with knight f3. And although this move is once again in the database and it is playable, it's black could pose some awkward problems for white. So in particular, I could have pushed this e-pawn and chased away his knight. Maybe I'll show the variation. If I had done that, his knight has to go somewhere. It's probably best for it to drop back. Excuse me. Drop back to e2, where it puts a double attack on my pawn. I can support that pawn. Better get a better drink than that. Okay, hopefully that's better. I can support that pawn with c5, but this is a little overextended now, and he can continue to attack it. And it, in some sense, puts me on the defensive. I'm having to maintain that strong pawn center. And that's not the sort of game I was looking for. I wanted something a bit more solid against Mike, because he can be a dangerous attacking player. So instead, I just played knight to f6, offering a target up in case he wanted to push his e-pawn, which is what he did. And I was happy to see that, because that allowed me to drop back to d7, which is a very natural square for the knight to go to in the advanced French. And now he defends his pawn, and before I go on to the next move, I should say he defends the pawn, but the problem is that unlike a normal advanced French, he doesn't have this pawn to c3 available anymore. So he's going to have more trouble holding his center than he normally should have in a advanced French. And black already has an edge here in this position. So I was tempted to play c5 right away. That's what the computer suggests. I was worried about that maneuver of the knight to that I suggested before, to b5 and then d6 check. If he did something like that immediately after c5, I could trade off with the bishop and he might have a weak advanced pawn on d6, but I didn't want to get into those complexities. So instead I made a more positional move, which actually turned out to be very strong in this game, and I was quite happy with it. a6, and once and for all, I keep the knight out of that square. Not only that, it cuts down an important square for his bishop. So it cuts out all the ideas of any bishop checks or pins or anything along this diagonal, and only leaves him the two remaining squares of e2 and d3 to put his bishop on. Okay, he chose one of those. He chose e2. I think d3 would have been a more aggressive square because it would allow this attack along that diagonal of h7. It would make me think 2 or 3 times before I'd castle my king over there. But instead, with the bishop on e2, I'm not feeling anywhere near so worried. I went ahead with the French plan of c5 to attack his center, try to break it up. Okay, he castled because I'm not immediately threatening to win it. I don't want to give him that good outpost for his knight. But then I can attack again. And he defended with his bishop. And at this point, he's probably best off just going ahead and exchanging. Well, actually, it's black's move. I played queen c7. Now it's white's move. And this is where he should consider exchanging. So as I show in this line here in my notes, he can just go ahead and take my pawn. I take back with the bishop. He could exchange bishops. And I take back with the knight. And then he could just go on developing his rook to e1. And he's adequately defending this pawn on e5 now, even though it doesn't look like it. It's the typical sort of French defense of these extended pawns because of the check. So, for example, if I were so foolish as to take that pawn, he would simply take my knight, and he's won a piece. So if I want to go in with my queen and really lose a lot of material, then I could just play bishop to b5 check, and he would, I'd take his bishop and he'd take my queen. And that didn't appeal to me at all. So French players are used to these various ideas of losing pieces on either d4 or e5, and usually don't get caught by these see-through attacks. So instead, he played queen to d2 instead of doing all those exchanges. And queen to d2 allows me to win a pawn now in the center. So I took on d4. Actually, the win of the pawn isn't forced. And he could have maintained the pawn by taking with the bishop. So he took back with the knight, which I think is a mistake. If he'd taken back with the bishop, and I then chose to try to win the pawn with either one of my knights, he could trade off a pair of knights. And then after that, the problem is that my king is stuck in the center, and it's subject to attack. And that was why I didn't want to open up the center with my development lagging so badly. It's asking for disaster. And although I didn't look at quite exactly this line during the game, this line that the computer is suggesting is the strongest way to exploit my king being stuck in the center, and that's simply to take my d-pawn with the knight, and with his knight. And then after I take his knight back, he shows that it's not really a sacrifice because he can play the queen to e3, and now the knight, of course, is pinned along the file to the king, so the knight can't move. It's attacked twice by the queen and the bishop. defended once. If I defended a second time, which I could certainly do, then he could attack it with a pawn. So one way or the other, he's going to get this knight back. And it's going to rip my center open with me behind the development. It would be not a happy situation. So rather than allow him to go down that line that turns a disadvantage into an advantage, what he should have, I'm sorry. Well, okay. Rather than go into that line, I wouldn't have played knight takes d4 back in this position. If he played bishop takes, I probably would have traded knight for the bishop, or maybe played bishop to c5 as another possibility. Either one is a reasonable move. But instead, he played knight takes on d4. And after knight takes, then I can go ahead and take the e-pawn successfully. And he gets some compensation for it. It's not a whole pawn's advantage. It's like 6/10 of a pawn or something, because he can play f4, and now he's kind of launching jet-assisted takeoff on his attack against my king. But if I'm careful, I think I can hold the position, and the computer seems to agree with me. So my idea here was to go ahead and play knight to c4, and this way I'm forcing off a pair of one of his two bishops, either his dark squared bishop or the light squared bishop. He chose to go ahead and trade the light squared bishop for my knight. He could have moved the queen, and then I would have taken his dark squared bishop. And I took back with the queen. And now if you notice in this position, I'm underdeveloped. He has a queen, 2 pieces, and he's castled. I have the queen in 1 piece, and I'm not castled. So I'm one piece behind the development plus castling. So I'm at least 2 moves behind the development, and he's on the move. So sort of 2.5 tempi here. So it's not a happy situation time-wise for black. So black has to play quite solidly over the next several moves, precisely. He played knight to e2. So over the next half a dozen moves or so, I think there's a bit of time wasted on White's part redeploying these knights. And he probably should have figured out a more aggressive way to come directly after me, chasing back my queen and so on. Instead, he moved the knight back. It gave me a chance to play my knight to f6, which is how I was planning to defend. After what I was seeing was that this f-pawn back in this position, I expected f5. And after f5, I was thinking about knight f6, pawn takes, and probably bishop takes here. So this position where I was going to use the knight to shield this sensitive f2 square here, and also to protect these light squares from various checks and things over on my king side. So I figured it was an important defending piece. He didn't do that though, since he instead had the knight back. So in this position, he didn't play the pawn to f5, so he dropped the knight back. And that gives me time to go ahead and reposition my knight ahead of time before he even pushes his pawn. And also this opens up the diagonal for this bishop now to start exerting influence on the f5 square. So there's 2 attacks. And if he plays pawn up, I can just go ahead and capture his pawn right now with pawn takes pawn. So that was a crucial waste of time. He attacked my queen, but that's not a problem. I can drop back, and now he's got some weaknesses on the dark squares over here. I started thinking about the possibility that I might be able to play my bishop to b4. Okay, it didn't do that, and it's actually, why didn't I do that? Well, he can defend with the bishop on d4, I guess. So, if I played here, he could simply defend like that, and that would be okay. Let's double check with the computer. This is looking good for black. Was it any? But it has been looking good for black. Okay, so it's there's nothing, no big problem that was presented by the fact that he allowed the bishop possibly time to come into b4. Instead, I played my bishop to d6. I wanted to exert, the idea was to keep this pawn at home, this f pawn, because now if the pawn were to move, this knight on g3 is only defended once. I would be able to take and then take back with my queen. So he again maneuvered his knight, wanting, I assume, to get into d4 with the other knight, or to at least defend the bishop there, support it. Gave me time to castle. Okay, he played h3, which does keep my knight out. So I didn't mention it, but if I wanted to, I could have taken time to try to win his dark squared bishop with my knight, or trade it knight for bishop. But the problem with this is that then that really seriously weakens this g3 square. And now I have these two pieces attacking g3, so it really holds down the f-pawn, even though he's taken time to defend it with his other knight. Okay, right now I went ahead and developed my bishop. Now, I should, in this position, I should point out very briefly that in this game, as in many games in the French defense, black's real problem piece is this light squared bishop and trying to get it out because his pawn on e6 locks it in. And I have other pawns on light squares as well. It's just a hard pawn structure to live with. And in this game, it's no different. In fact, it remains a problem for a while. But I decided to try to get it at least out of the way of my rooks, get them connected so that I can maneuver them on the back rank. One of the ideas here was that I would be playing my rook to c8 so that if his rook comes to c1, indirectly attacking my queen, let's undo that. Sorry. Indirectly attacking my queen, then I would be able to play my queen back to b8 without locking my rook in. So after the rook moves, my queen could find a harbor on b8 and still exert the pressure along this long dark square diagonal. So that was a kind of maneuver I was looking at. Let's scroll up a bit here. Okay, so at this point Mike played knight to d4. It looks like a good square because it is hard to chase it away, but its prospects are sort of dim too because this light squared bishop now actually and my pawns control squares that it might want to go to. So I looked for a while at moves such as this pawn to e5, but the problem with that, whenever I make that move, is that one of his knights, this knight first, the d knight, can come into f5, and I've given up this square. This is an important square. I could exchange off my problem bishop for that knight, but I'm still giving away that f5 square, which is not something I'm eager to do. It's a crucial attacking square against my king. Okay, so I didn't mean to leave that engine on. That's why my fan is racing and making such a noise, at least that is distracting for me, if not for you. So after he went to d4, I went ahead and continued with the idea of deploying my rook to the c file. Now I'm having ideas of at some point maybe going ahead and making that e-pawn move, trading off a bishop for a knight, and then winning the pawn on c2. Mike moved his queen at this point. I should point out the other idea was to, makes a little more sense if you see it from here, was to play queen to c3 and try to encourage a trade of queens, although it wouldn't force it, even if he waited a move, because he could always move his queen at that point. But he sort of preemptively moved his queen and put it on this file, the F file here, where they're attacking after some clearances. They're attacking this weak F7 point near my king. It also continues to defend the pawn on D4 from where he's at. So there's some nice things going for that square. Okay, so at this point, I should say that, let me clear those. Well, I'll leave the arrows on. At this point, I had a hard time figuring out what move to make, and spent a lot of time on this next move. So I started with 52 minutes, and I thought for 12 minutes, so I went down to 40 minutes on this move. And it's not, the move I ended up making is nowhere near a 12-minute move, I think. You know, I just went ahead and advanced my B pawn. But the problem is that everything else that I looked at actually made my position worse. So I'm not really in Zugzwang, but I'm in a position that's hard to improve. And so I'll just point out a couple of very quick examples of things that make it worse. So if I push this E pawn, then that frees his knight to go in, start using the F5 square. I didn't want to do that. If I play knight to F5, or knight to E4, then he could have traded off knights and then pushed the F pawn prior to my being able to support my E4 point with my F pawn, and so then this becomes quite a weak point here on E4. So I didn't want to do that. Let's see, what else? If I move my queen or bishop off of this diagonal that they're currently on, then I don't have this, I'm not gluing the F pawn in place. So right now he can't move the F pawn. Sorry about all the arrows. But he can't move the F pawn because this knight is only defended once by his queen. And because my bishop and queen attacking through the cover of the pawn. If I move either my bishop or the queen, that's not true, and that F pawn becomes mobile. Anyhow, I couldn't figure out a good move. This move I didn't like very well because it's just looks like it's further entombing my bishop on C7, building the white squared prison. But the idea that I came up with was, well, I wouldn't leave this pawn on, or hopefully I wouldn't leave the pawn on B5 for too long, because I would follow up by expanding on the queen side with A5 and then either A4 or B4. So, move up with those pawns, maybe end up playing my rooks over there and play on the queen side, and just to maintain the position on my king side. Okay, Mike redeveloped his knight. As I said, these knights do spend a lot of time dancing around in this game. That allowed me to come in and attack his queen, but he's able to come out and pressurize my king side, and I didn't like that. So I offered a queen trade, figuring that since I'm a pawn ahead, a trade of queens at this point is probably a good thing for me. It's not a great thing for me because the position's still a little closed, and my bishop pair, especially my light squared bishop, are not as good as as one would want them to be. But I was still willing to trade queens. He wasn't, though. He went back to E1. But that gave me time to start to advance in the center. So I played F6, preparing for E5. He brought the knight back to try to get my knight out of the center. I could have dropped back to C5, but I chose not to. Instead, I traded off the knights, and that gave me time to play the E5 move. So now the beauty of this, of course, is that this bishop that I've been worried about so far during the whole game all of a sudden has a new lease on life, and it's looking all the way at his H-pawn. So that's plus the two pawns in the center there on E5 and D5 give me a lot of control that I exert over the various squares in front of them. So he played knight to f3. The computer wanted to see a slightly different line. In fact, I expected him to, instead of playing knight to f3, I expected him to play f takes e5, f takes e5, and then I didn't know if he exchanged rooks or not, but if he did, and the queen takes back, the knight still has to drop back, and better go somewhere, and that pawn on c2 falls. So no matter what he does, that pawn on c2 is a goner. So instead, he dropped immediately back to f3, and I did an exchange on f4 2 times, and then took on c2. And now I've won a second pawn. Black is 2 pawns ahead. I have 6 of them to white's 4. But white has a little bit of the initiative. I've got this weak pawn here on d5 that I'm going to have to worry about and do something with. And my bishop's still not the strongest piece in the world. My queen is not very active. So I need some way to get my pieces more active in order to counteract his nicely deployed pieces. So at this point, he played queen to g3. I forget why I decided he did that, but right now it doesn't look terribly logical. And it gave me time to play my queen to c7, offering a queen trade and also taking over some control of the c file. Right, so this the square on c1 now, if you moved either rook to it, it would be lost. So that's one reason for my queen to go to c7, and I would have been happy to trade, even though it meant my rook coming back from the 7th rank. He avoided the trade and went to h4, and I decided to cash in on the check. It's been lurking there for a while. I could have checked on b6 a few moves ago. I checked on c5 here. It chases. I wanted to see where his king would go to, if he'd go to the corner, or I thought maybe he'd go to h2, in which case there would be a pin on this pawn on g2. But he went to the corner. And then I was able to play my other rook to e8 and grab a hold of that open file. And he played his queen back to f4 where it was before. This allowed me to double my rooks and attack that weak pawn on g2. So that's starting to look a little scary for white, and I was feeling pretty good at this point. And I thought he might go in for, the line of going in for kind of the obvious knight fork of my 2 rooks. But the way I analyzed it was that I would be okay there because my rook would be able to attack his queen, seemingly just about winning the knight, but he can come back with the check. He wins a tempo, which makes, I could play either the rook back or the queen back. The queen's a little better. He trades queens, and then that gives me time to get my rook out of trouble, but then he gets to defend his knight. And so there was a lot of moving around, but no material was won or lost in that sequence. So neither one of us is losing anything, but it allowed me to get to quite a simplified game, and I would have been very happy to have that happen. Instead of doing that, he kept the queens on, and he went to b8 check immediately. Okay. When I was coming up to this, after I played I doubled my rooks on the 7th, pigs on the 7th. My intention to a queen check was to play bishop c8. Bishop c8 there, blocking with the bishop. But then after I got to looking at the position, I decided that the bishop was a little too, that bishop was pinned on c8, and it was a little too scary having it pinned there. And I was worried about him infiltrating on the e file. Now the computer doesn't see any trouble here. It's happy. It thinks I'm still at -3 or whatever. Big advantage for black, winning advantage. But I got to worrying a bit about that. So instead I backpedaled for a while. So I dropped my rook back to block the check. Then he went back with his queen, maybe hoping I would repeat moves or something. And then instead I dropped my queen back, offering another queen trade again. Same idea as before. He didn't accept it. He went to b4. I'm able to attack the white queen there. And he went to h4, which is a better square. I'm able to attack it with my rook. But then he's able to go to h5. And now I started to have real thoughts at this point that I might be losing the game because I was significantly behind on the clock, and there are some real threats here. So I found myself looking at stupid moves like well, the problem is, go back there. How do I defend this d pawn? Well, it turns out really the only good way if I'm intent on defending it is to go ahead and play bishop to c6. But then I didn't like moves like rook to c8, where he starts to get active against my pin pawn. I'm sorry, my pin bishop. That looks scary. I also thought about things like bishop to e6 and realized, fortunately, fairly quickly that would lead to checkmate in one, because I've shut off the defense of the rook's defense of the e8 square. So that wouldn't be a good move. I was worried that if I didn't want to give the d pawn back, but I was willing to because I'm 2 pawns ahead. It's a passed pawn, and it could be very valuable. So I really didn't want to give it away, but. I mean, it's the winning advantage in the game. The game isn't necessarily won without it. But I definitely didn't want to have him take it with check and win my rook, for example. But after looking at this position for a long, long time, I decided that maybe my best move would be to go ahead and let him take that pawn. And so I went ahead and played queen to g3 with the idea that he could go ahead and take the pawn, but that I have a mate threat here on g2. Queen takes g2 mate, and he would have to answer that. So let's get the right position here. So he did play queen takes d5 check. Oh no. Okay. Okay, so he didn't. So after I threatened mate on g2, he didn't play queen takes d5 check. Instead, he he could have, but then the queen would be under. That would have been a bad idea because if he does that, then I could have blocked with the bishop. Actually, this is an interesting line, but I'm threatening mate and also threatening his queen at the same time. I'm not sure if he can get out of this. Yeah, it's better for white. The thing is that he has some checks, and I probably have nothing better than to drop my rook back to defend. So he didn't do that immediately. Instead, he went ahead and took the time to defend with his rook. But then I put in a third attack on that g-pawn. So he has to do something about the threat of rook takes pawn, which is possibly coming up. And what he did was to, go ahead and took my e-pawn with check. I went ahead and blocked with the bishop, which, now his queen is under attack. He has to do something about that. He can come and attack me on e8 with a check. My king came up to 7, and now he played, unfortunately, losing move here with knight to d4, forking my rooks, which allows queen check, leading to an immediate checkmate. Because after pawn takes queen, rook to h2 is mate, and that's force. Now it turns out that he actually had quite a bit better of a move. Rather than playing knight to d4, he could have gone ahead and checked me on b7, and I thought that this was great for me, that I would just escape through g6, and that I would, that he really had a hard time now defending against that threat on g7, that he'd have to give away his knight or something, and I could take it in order to open up the queen's defense. But it turns out that if he went ahead and forked my two rooks, that now that, it's actually not such a great position for black anymore. It's slightly to white's advantage, because I don't have this queen takes h3 check motif anymore, because now when he plays g takes h3, that's a counter check, and my queen just got lost, and all of a sudden he's going to be able to defend against the checkmate threat and not lose his queen while he's doing it. So this is not a happy situation for. So knight takes h2 or e2, or the knight could take on c2. You take either one of the rooks, and white's just winning here. So it would have been very bad. Hopefully I would have, after knight to d4, I would have seen that I shouldn't take the h-pawn. I think I would have, and just gone ahead and let him win the exchange. But it still would have been a nasty turn of events, and I was getting short on time. So it was an exciting game down to the very end, and it was for me, it was a good start to the club championship, but there's still 6 rounds to go. It's a 7-round, 8-player round robin. The next 2 weeks, I have postponed matches, and the reason is because we're taking a vacation trip over to Europe to see my youngest son get married, and going to visit a few countries over there, and then we'll be back home in, I guess, in 3 weeks. So until the next video, this is Roger Capello signing off, saying have fun at the chessboard. Bye-bye.